Yes. So, welcome to the last session of today. I'll lift it a little bit up. So, I'd like to introduce Pathik Wadhwa, and I know I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, but it's, you say it as you spell it, Pathik Wadhwa. He is a professor of Irvine for several disciplines, and it's too long to do the whole list, but the main parts are human behavior, psychiatry, obstetrics, so good. And we have been working together on many projects, and we just did a conference last week on conditioning, and I've seen he's given the slide the same title, although in the booklet there's a different title. Don't get worried. It's a little bit a different title in the booklet. It's still the right content, although the title here hasn't changed. So I'll give you Pathik, and we'll follow. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you all for coming here. As Yap mentioned, we did this so-called Explorations Conference last weekend, and we talked about freedom from the known. And so this is an adaptation from the conference. So if any of you have suffered through that last weekend, then maybe you might want to think again about. So here's what I hope to broadly go through. I want to present a one or two slide synopsis of our best understanding of Krishnamurti's formulation on freedom from the known, and then raise a few questions that come from that understanding, and then address the general question of how is it that we've come to acquire the specific physical and mental characteristics that we have. And I hope to address this question at two levels. One is at the level of the individual, that is, try to understand what produces variation from one person to another in the characteristics that she or he have come to acquire, and where do those come from. And then also try to address the same question, but this time at the level of the population. So how is it that humans have come to acquire the characteristics they have, and other species, those characteristics that they might have, and so on. The purpose of all of this is to try and bring a little bit more of an appreciation of the phenomenon of conditioning, because I'm going to make the argument that the way we acquire the specific characteristics that we have, all the way down to not just the individual, but tissues, groups of cells, and even within cells, is nothing but the process of conditioning. That's the argument I hope to make. And then, having covered that ground so that we have an appreciation, more of an appreciation of this phenomenon of conditioning, then come back to Krishnamurti's questions and look at what might be meant again from that, in terms of that formulation of freedom from the known. So in a nutshell, and I'm going to try to do this because I need to look at my own slides. Krishnamurti's concern, as we all know, was quote unquote to set man unconditionally free, and he suggested that the known, which is the repository of all knowledge about the past and the brain and body's responses to the past, influences responses to the present. And this process of information about responses to the past influencing how I respond to something in the present is described by the term conditioning. And our best understanding of what Krishnamurti meant by freedom was the state or process wherein responses to present situations or circumstances or conditions are not necessarily influenced by the past. Again, not necessarily influenced. That's at least our best understanding of how he used the word freedom. And I won't go into why he suggested this is an important consideration, and we'll get to the how maybe briefly a little bit later in terms of how he suggested this might come about. So then again, conditioning is the phenomenon whereby responses to the present are influenced by prior information or memory about responses to the past. And Krishnaji asked the question, is it possible for the brain or the mind to be totally free from conditioning, and emphasized totally as opposed to partially, and emphasized psychological as opposed to biological or physical conditioning? And his assertions were yes, it is possible to be totally free. Furthermore, he suggested that this possibility exists for or within each individual or every individual. And so here are some of the questions that I hope to discuss with you briefly. And we've lost the... You think it's gone to sleep? I'm so used to having my slides to guide me that I feel completely hopeless without them. I mean, I could probably come up with something, but knowing they're there, they're absolutely, yeah. I didn't talk about it. I never ever professed to. Yeah, that's it. And that thingy is going round and round, so who knows? Let's see. So we're going to talk briefly, I hope briefly, about the question of what's the origin of the phenomenon of conditioning. Then we're going to consider briefly again, is psychological conditioning different from physical conditioning, or is psychological just a specific case or a domain within the larger entity that we call physical? And if one says that there is a certain possibility for each and every person, what are the implications of that kind of assertion biologically and evolutionarily? So then, after going through what I said I'd try and go through, I'm going to come back to these two questions and look at these two questions in light of what I'm going to discuss with you. One, is freedom from conditioning the absence of conditioning, or is it the absence of the effects of conditioning? And I hope to suggest to you that they're two different questions. Is it absence of the actual process of conditioning or the phenomenon, or is it absence of the effects? And similarly, is absence from effects of all conditioning, or is it absence from the effects of psychological conditioning? And then briefly talk about the how question. So the first part, which is how is it that we come to acquire the characteristics we have, is something that I happen to study as part of my academic life. I'm on the faculty at the University of California, Irvine, where I've established and I direct a program called the Development, Health and Disease Research Program. And in a single sentence, it's the study of the nature and consequences of the interplay between biological, behavioral, social and psychological processes in prenatal life or intrauterine life, life even before birth itself. That's what we happen to study. To briefly get you to what I hope will be a broad understanding of the logic behind why we study what we study, I'd present something like this. I'd show you a picture of 3 cars. Of course, the purpose of any automobile, broadly speaking, is to get you from point A to B. But if I were to ask you which of these is the quote-unquote best, then you'd probably say, well, it depends for what purpose, because there might not be an absolute best. If your criterion for best is speed, then it's going to be one of them. If it's safety, maybe another one. If it's hauling a large amount of cargo, it might be yet another one. This part's pretty apparent. The second part that I'm going to suggest to you, which is not always so apparent over and above for what purpose, is under what conditions is it going to be used. Because the best, for example, speed, the sports car might be fast only if the conditions are such that there are smooth paved roads. If the conditions in which you're going to operate the automobile is very hilly, boulders, rough terrain, no roads, then actually the SUV might be the fastest. So its purpose and conditions that together determine criteria such as best. So obviously, when one constructs a non-living entity, you reverse engineer it. The non-living entity has no role in its own construction. That seems pretty obvious. You determine the purpose and the conditions in which you're going to use it. You come up with a blueprint, and then you make it according to the plan. It's, in principle, fairly simple. However, you may or may not know that all living organisms play a very active role in their own development. They're not passively built. They play an active role. They participate in the process of their own construction. And there isn't a strict blueprint as there is for building a machine or a non-living entity. There's some restraints imposed by the heritable germline or the so-called genetic makeup at the time of conception, but there's a lot of leeway within that, and I'm going to try and discuss with you how it's the process of conditioning that determines how one lands up where one lands up. And I'll leave the third part out. So then, as we discussed with the example of the car's purpose and under what conditions, is there some generic single purpose that all living organisms must accomplish to go about the process of living itself? And in that context, if there is one, then in that context, what do we mean by the term conditions? And I'm going to suggest to you that the single most fundamental purpose that living organisms must accomplish in order to live, that there can be no purpose more fundamental than this one, is the process of energy capture, storage, and utilization. For the simple reason that in order to continue the process of living, work needs to be done, if for nothing else other than to sustain form and function, and energy is required, and nothing, living or non-living, can de novo synthesize energy. Everything on this planet gets its energy from photons that travel from the sun, and so all life form has to come up with ways to capture, store to some extent, and then use that energy to go about the process of living, which is simply maintaining form and function at a minimum. So then, if that is the most fundamental thing that life has to accomplish in order to stay alive, then the conditions that we're talking about are those conditions that relate to variation in energy substrate availability in the local environment. How much, in what forms, what's the stability of supply, that sort of thing. So then the concept of developmental programming, that's a fancy word we use for what we study, is simply in a simple sentence, this idea how well an individual is built or developed is an important determinant of her or his state or health and likelihood of developing disorders down the road. It's a very simple concept. How well something is developed or built is an important determinant of structural and functional integrity and likelihood of breakdown over time. And here we're going to focus on the terms built or developed. What does it mean in this context? What does the word well mean? Built means the acquisition of specific characteristics. Phenotype is just a biological term for characteristics. And well is really the process of optimization of characteristics to local environment or conditions. Just like with the car example, purpose and conditions are the two things that matter. And the optimization of purpose to conditions, the characteristics to conditions. I'm not going to spend much time going over this. These happen to be the major health disorders that are important globally, not just nationally, but globally. And for any of these disorders and many others, the likelihood of any individual experiencing a disorder is a joint function of two things. One is exposure to risk factors for that particular disorder. And then the second component is predisposition. Exposure to risk factors, that's a fairly straightforward concept. So for obesity, caloric excess might be a risk factor. For atherosclerosis, cholesterol, and for asthma, allergen exposure, and for depression, life event stress. These are all risk factors for particular conditions. But what do I mean by the term predisposition? Predisposition is a term used to define individual differences in susceptibility to one unit exposure of that risk factor. So if all of us were exposed to allergens, and I think all of us are being exposed, this room is awfully musty. There's something here that's, then it's individual differences in our bronchial reactivity that might determine who amongst us get an asthmatic episode right now and who are totally fine and who are somewhere in between. So you understand the concept of predisposition. And that's what we study. And the traditional concept is that predisposition is entirely contained in one's genetic makeup. And the concept that we've introduced and argued is that predisposition is not completely contained in one's genes or genetic makeup, but it's really the product of the interplay between genes and environmental conditions with a focus on that interaction during the period of development or construction of the organism. So that's the idea. And so the term phenotypic plasticity is used to describe the many different characteristics that can come about from any specific genotype as a function of different environmental conditions. And the term developmental programming then refers to the process whereby the developing embryo or fetus does three things: looks for actively, acquires, and then acts on information about the nature of conditions, local conditions, in the process of specification of form and function, to put it simply. So then, why is there this process of developmental programming? Because wouldn't it be much easier to simply have a blueprint and allow development to proceed along some generic blueprint? why all this extra trouble of searching for and getting cues about what kind of conditions I happen to exist in, and then using those? The answer is fairly simple, that even though this is a more time consuming, complicated, in terms of energetics, costly process to put in place and to execute, the advantage, of course, is that it affords the organism the opportunity to achieve some degree of congruence between the specifics of her or his form and function and the conditions in which she or he develops, and therefore presumably is afterwards going to exist or live in. So it's a way to optimize me to my surroundings. And we've discussed which environmental conditions, and I don't think we'll, for the purpose of this presentation, discuss the how part of it. And this slide is simply to share with you the notion that the vast majority of structural and functional development that we're ever going to undergo, we humans, already happens before the time we're born. From conception till adulthood, there are about 55 cell division cycles. The first one is when one cell, the fertilized egg, makes 2, and the second is 2 to 4, and the third is 4 to 8. And given how quickly things increase when they add on to one another exponentially, already by the time of birth, from one cell you've got about 6 trillion cells just in 40 weeks gestation, because 45 cell division cycles have occurred. There's only roughly 10 more that occur between birth and adulthood. And so we've asked the question of, do conditions in the intrauterine environment influence development and subsequent health outcomes? Now I'm going to just fly through a bunch of slides simply to tell you what kinds of conditions are influenced by this process. But I'm not going to go and for the purpose of this presentation try and give you specific technical details about how we do the studies and how it is that we've come to the conclusions that we've come to so far. But I'm happy to talk about those with you, with any of you who are interested later. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to fly through a set of slides now. So the first question we asked was about premature birth, the process of being born either too early and or too small. And we've concluded that after taking into account other known risk factors, things related to stress and stress biology have an important influence in terms of the likelihood of a baby being born too early and or too small. This is significant because babies that are born too early and or too small are at risk for a whole host of disorders down the road in life. Premature birth is considered a very important adverse health outcome. This is to simply tell you that we're not satisfied with just correlating environmental conditions with outcomes, but we are interested in the details of the how or what processes or mechanisms underlie these sorts of effects. So we study in detail maternal, placental, fetal, endocrine processes, and we've published a whole bunch of studies on how that works. We study immune processes in pregnancy, and we've published a whole bunch of studies on how maternal conditions influence the immunology of the mother, the placenta, and the fetus, and how that translates into health outcomes both of the brain and the body. We've studied several gene-environment interactions of the mother's genotype and the baby's genotype, and combinations of those in different environmental contexts. We've studied what some of you might have heard of this term epigenetics, which is the regulation of genes or the expression of genes. It's not changes to the genetic makeup, but it's alterations in which proteins are made because which genes are read and transcribed and which ones aren't. We're interested in these processes, and we can document how local conditions influence the epigenetic characteristics of the developing embryo and child, with then long-term implications. We've looked not just at birth outcomes, but we've looked initially at risk of disease in adulthood, and we've published a number of studies that suggest that compared to non-exposed individuals, healthy young adult men and women exposed, for example, to high levels of stress during pregnancy, display characteristics associated with risk of developing obesity, diabetes, heart disease, asthma, and even dementia in later life or memory loss. We then went to following these babies right from the time of birth onwards, carefully with studies of brain development and of body composition. We use a bunch of fancy techniques to do this. The two main sets of studies have to do with obesity and metabolic risk. We do things like DEXA scans at birth and 3 months, 6 months, and look at some of these pathways and conclude that it's not just size, but it's the amount of fat starting right at the time of birth that is influenced by prenatal conditions. Brown fat is inversely influenced. Some of you have heard of this concept of brown fat, the metabolically active fat that's considered good for you, that's healthy, that is protective against disease. We do all kinds of brain imaging studies. We have terrific cooperation from our subjects. They bring their babies in often late afternoons, evenings when they're tired out, so they fall asleep in the MRI scanner, and on average we do an hour and a half of brain imaging, starting right at birth and then at frequent intervals. And we can show how prenatal conditions influence different aspects of the structure of the brain, the connections between different brain areas, and also the function. So you've got structure, you've got structural connections of fiber tracts, and then you've got function, as in which areas function in conjunction with which other areas. And we study all of that with brain imaging. We are considering the hypothesis that even though aging and age-related disorders obviously happen in older ages, we proposed and are making progress demonstrating that the rate of aging and individual differences, the differences between me and you in the rate of aging, that setting actually happens even before the time of birth. And we study a system called telomere biology. We study how cells use energy and variation from person to person in the efficiency of energy capture and utilization, and the propensity, the difference between me and you in the tendency to either store energy as fat or burn it as heat, and it's mitochondrial function that underlies this. We go all the way to studying the very first cells, stem cells, and look at programming of stem cells, and the microbiome. We don't stop prenatally, but continue to study postnatal processes. One of those we're very interested in is the composition of breast milk. We study various special populations. I'm going through these things fast. This is some of the stuff in the popular press. So the general idea here, and I think I can tell you what the conclusion is that the way we acquire our specific mental and physical characteristics, something that is very important, that we then retain pretty much for the rest of our life, that has critical implications for our state of health and disease risk. The way we come to acquire those is through the process of, number one, as we develop, looking and getting a readout of conditions in which we're developing. Number two, consolidating that information into epigenetic processes and through a bunch of these other biological pathways that I mentioned to you. And then using this consolidated information of conditions over time and responses to those conditions during development in the very building or the construction of the brain and body. I want to suggest to you that this is not some optional process. This is not a process where you can think about exposure to things and then, no exposure to harmful things. If organisms do not do what I'm describing, look for, acquire, and then incorporate information, they could not develop, they could not be built. So I'm suggesting to you that the process of conditioning goes as deep as the very acquisition of the characteristics we have. It's not that I'm prejudiced and I don't like certain groups and someone else isn't prejudiced. Of course, that's part of conditioning, but I'm going to use the word a very superficial part of it. Superficial in terms of the depth to which this process operates. The sense behind this is not something gone haywire. The sense behind it is that it seems logical to try and produce somebody who is well optimized to have characteristics that function well in the conditions in which he or she is going to live. So, for example, if an animal is gestating or in early life in an environment where there are a lot of predators, it's an adaptive process to have a brain and perceptual systems that are very, very, very vigilant, all the time looking for danger. Stress systems that even when there's a little bit of a doubt that this stimulus might be dangerous, no, don't wait to actually find out the fact of the matter. Respond, and respond with a big fear response, stress response. That's adaptive in that context. For us, when we develop similar physiologies, it may not be adaptive when there's a mismatch between those conditions in which we develop and find ourselves with. Another example, if I'm developing in conditions where there isn't much glucose, for example, then it might be adaptive for my cell to be very thrifty, to hang on to every spare calorie I can find and store it, because there's not too much to go around and who knows when the next set of calories is coming. But if that was created because either my mother happened to be malnourished or she had some sort of placental problem and there was problem with transfer of nutrients, then that same set of characteristics that I acquire are going to now be conferring risk even under conditions of normal diet. They're going to be conferring risk for me becoming obese. My predisposition might be much more than yours in terms of becoming obese and then developing diabetes. So you see that it can go both ways, but there's a deep sense, a deep rationale for using the process of conditioning, which is the acquisition and consolidation of information about conditions over time, in the process of acquisition of characteristics. I hope you can appreciate that there's a role for conditioning, that it's not, unless one knows a little bit about this or thinks about it, it might look as if this is entirely an unhealthy process. No, in balance, it confers a lot more to us than perhaps takes away from us. So now I'm going to consider briefly at the level of the population, and maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just tell you what some of the conclusions are, and you either take me or don't take me at my word for it. I can certainly walk you through the details, but it would be more interesting to end quickly and then have a chance to talk a little bit. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. I'm just going to look at my slides so that I can tell you what I want to say from these, so don't bother trying to read them. No, really, don't bother. Just allow me to tell you what I think the bottom line is. So here's the bottom line. We believe, by we I mean the larger body of biologists and chemists and physicists, we believe that life is a certain kind of chemistry called an autocatalytic reaction. All of life can essentially be described in terms of chemistry. And an autocatalytic reaction is one that just, once it starts, goes on and never stops, as long as the two entities that produce the reaction are present, because one of these entities also acts as a catalyst for the reaction. So if there's an autocatalytic reaction where one of the outcomes of that reaction is some sort of replication or copying process of something, it can be as vague as that, and as long as that copying process is not accurate, there are some errors in the copying. If these 3 or 4 conditions are fulfilled, then that in fact is the most fundamental definition of life. That's something that's well agreed on now. So I'm going to show you one particular study later to suggest to you that life doesn't need something injected into non-living stuff in order to produce living things. We're absolutely certain as we can be, that you don't need some additional thing to be injected into non-living matter to produce life. Life is just a specific form of a chemical reaction that happens in matter. It's an entirely material process, I'm going to argue. So now to sustain life, this thing has to, as I already mentioned, capture energy. And it has to be able to have enough energy to at least withstand the force of entropy. The second law of thermodynamics, one of the most fundamental laws of this universe, says that all things fall apart if left to themselves, the process of entropy. Things don't spontaneously stay the way they are, and they certainly spontaneously don't become more complex. In fact, things that are complex become simple and fall apart and dissipate. So if anything that happens to be living, to find itself alive, which is defined by this kind of chemistry, needs to stay that way, it has to capture energy to do the work of withstanding the force of entropy. And the amount of energy it has to capture has to exceed the amount needed to do the work of staying put. And the reason it has to find more than it needs is because some of that is always going to be lost to heat. That's again part of the second law of thermodynamics. So the process of capturing more is fundamental to the process of life. It's not an option. It's not because of greed or something, or because I always like having more. It's much deeper and more basic than that. So then in this process, there are different energetic solutions, and the ones that work better in a particular context are going to persist. The ones that don't, the organisms that have those are going to be gone from the population pool. And so there's competition between mechanisms to do this, to increase efficiency. This competition can lead and does lead to cooperation in many cases, because if a unit can work with another unit and increase the efficiency of both, it's going to be a mechanism that comes into being. And if it cannot do that, it's going to fall apart again. This thing can never ever end, and it can never stop. It can't end because of the autocatalytic nature of the process, and it can't ever stop because it can never reach an efficiency of 1. It cannot hypothetically be that I can be so efficient as to use all the energy I capture to do work and I don't lose any to heat. That state cannot come about. So because of all these reasons, fundamental to the autocatalytic reaction that replicates is the process of collecting more than actually needed. This is not a conscious decision. You don't need brains for this. Even the most primordial forms of life do this. There's always a drive to achieve more efficient energy capture solutions. So I've superimposed words like suffering, desire, conflict, the process of becoming. These are words we use, and by no means am I arguing that the components of a cell understand the word suffering or desire, but I'm arguing to you that this is fundamentally where these, or at least the substrates of these processes get created. Let me not say these things get created, but the underlying substrates, always present, cannot ever be fulfilled. This is a bit pessimistic, but it happens to, I would argue, be the fact of the matter, logically. The business of competition and cooperation occurring in the context of cooperation, I've discussed that with you. Because the efficiency of energy capture solutions is always enhanced by a process that has the ability to contain in it and use information about previous attempts, i.e. conditioning. Because imagine two processes, one that has information about the past and one that doesn't, that's starting sort of from a blank slate over and over again. So because information is what allows prediction, so that's the birth of this phenomenon of becoming different from what I am. I'm throwing words out there. And we've already discussed memory and conditioning. So the one last point I want to leave you with in terms of this discussion of life is the following, which is several people have this notion, and intuitively I understand that. Intuitively it feels like there is something so different about living entities from non-living things that there must be something, the spirit of life, for want of a better word. How could it be that the same inanimate matter that produces non-living things also produce life without anything extra? I understand the feeling, but I want to emphasize that that has never been borne out. And I want to share with you that as recently as about, what is the date today? The 5th of May, right? The 4th. The 4th of May. So only 3 weeks ago, this paper was published in Science Reports, Science Robotics. Just 3 weeks ago, they synthesized a piece of DNA and built certain conditions, and essentially what they could do with that was to produce something that captured, stored, used energy, replicated, moved. They could set two of these things up in a competition with one another so that features of movement that were better persisted in the replicates and not others, so displaying some primordial form of evolution. They don't call this life, or they didn't in this paper, but it sure looks like the definition of life. So this is one of many examples out there. This is just something I picked, not because it's particularly new, but it's just the most recent evidence I could find that if one knows how, one can combine chemistry in a way that produces life or looks awfully a lot like life, and that has many of the characteristics without the injection of anything else into it. So then in terms of the process of psychological conditioning, I want to, again, without going through too many details, suggest to you that there is essentially no difference between something that we think of as psychological and physical in its makeup, in what produces, in what's necessary to evoke it. I'm going to suggest that we typically think of brains as prerequisites for having psychological states and feelings, and I want to tell you that that is absolutely not the case, that lots of forms of life have the biology of emotion and the behavior that emotion produces, as in motivation towards or being afraid of and moving away from, well before brains are formed. There are so many species of organisms that do not have brains. Many do not even have nerves, that have the biology that we now know is that underlies all psychological states. And there are several other examples. So again, I'm going to suggest to you that all of psychology is contained within biology, though not necessarily the other way around. So this distinction of material processes, where you say some, and psychological processes are absolutely material. I know the word historically comes from psyche, of the spirit, not of matter, and so on, but that, it's been decades since that kind of separation between the two has been accepted, and it just isn't tenable. The word persists, of the spirit as opposed to of the soma or the physical, but it's just a specific case of the soma or matter. And as I said, among other things, comes about well before the brain. So we've discussed a little bit, honestly we haven't discussed it, but I've just made a bunch of assertions and asked you to accept it at face value, but I hope you at least, I hope I managed to at least convey a little bit of the sort of sense and the logic behind the presentation. I know we haven't had time to discuss and look critically at the evidence. So then the questions we're left with are that if the very basis for life, if the very basis for the existence of life, for the origin and propagation of life, is the movement from potential to specific, and if this movement is in part the imprint of the past on the present, then how do we hear this concept of freedom from conditioning? And is this concept even compatible with the notion of life itself? I want to take you to that level, not superficialities like how can I not have the biases and prejudices that I happen to have, but I'm really taking this question down to the level of the existence of life itself. If the brain and its output, the mind, inherently represents an attempt at consolidation of the past in order to make predictions, then if there's a consolidation of the past in order to do what it does, how is this compatible with the notion of the brain being free from conditioning, which is what we've often heard in at least in some of Krishnamurti's language? And if the concept of the psyche as separate from the soma is untenable, then how does one address this issue of freedom from psychological conditioning, if there's no such thing as psychological that's separate from physical? So then we come back to these questions, and I thought at least had a good discussion of these at the conference we had last weekend. Some of you were here, like Rabindra. Don't know if you share my. So we decided, at least intellectually, that Krishnamurti could not have meant, when he said free from conditioning, he could not have meant the absence of conditioning. What he perhaps meant was the absence of the consequences or the effects of conditioning, but not the phenomenon of conditioning, for among other reasons, for some of the reasons I've shared with you. And when Krishnamurti said absence from the effects of psychological conditioning, again, we felt, at least collectively, and I don't know if you agree with me that that's what we felt at the conference, that it's not the absence of a psychological response that is born of the past. It's not that. At least that's how we understood. But it's something that happens after that response, that conditioned response gets evoked, something to do with maybe the perpetuation of that response, giving life to it, the sense of self. I don't think we mapped it all out, but we did rule out, at least I think we ruled out the notion that the absence of psychological conditioning is not that the psychological responses, conditioned responses, do not come about. When I see you, it's not just that I have a recollection of your name, but the state that I experienced when I last saw you a week ago, and it might have been positive, it might have been negative. It's not the absence of that memory, the psychological aspect of it, but it's something that then happens that we speculate Krishnamurti might have been talking about. We speculate because none of us made the assertion that we knew one way or the other as a fact. So this helped us a little bit. It didn't lead us to what Krishnaji means by freedom from conditioning, but this kind of deliberation helped us to speculate what he did not mean. And we hadn't been as clear as we were before going through this process. We considered, and this wasn't something, I'm not going to spend time on this, but I just want to share with you that we did consider the question of perception, because Krishnaji said that the way the process or state of freedom from the known could come about is through the engagement of something that he called awareness or observation or direct perception of the nature of the process. The way this works is how he described it, not the content of it, but if there's observation of the process in action, then that observation or perception in and of itself, he suggested, could end the process. And so we looked at the way perception is understood in biology and psychology. We asked questions like the role of the sense of self as a separate entity. Is that a prerequisite for perception? Can organisms that do not have a sense of self perceive anything? Can everything that exists be perceived? Does everything that is perceived actually exist? Is there something called direct first-hand immediate perception, or is all perception always after the fact, if you will? Are perceptions generally geared towards ascertaining the accuracy of what is being perceived, or are they always geared towards some sort of distortions or biases in the manner in which perceptions work? And what if there are biases, and if there are type 1 errors, that means the susceptibility of believing things. I would rather believe something is true if it's false, rather than say something is false than true. So there are three kinds of perception broadly. There is accurate in the middle. Yeah, it sees what it is and says no to what's not the fact of the matter. There's a perception with a type 1 error, which is that if I'm not sure, if there's a preposition that something's true and I'm not sure, I'm going to tend to believe it and say it's true or it's likely true. That's called a type 1 bias. And a type 2 bias is one where when something is true or the fact of the matter, but I'm not sure, I'm going to say it's false. And in the whole world of the science of perception, we know that we are biased, we as in humans, although different people have different degrees of the bias, not everyone is biased the same extent. And we're biased towards making type 1 errors. Our perceptual systems are not built to see things the way they are, but to move us in bias towards type 1 errors. That is probably why historically prepositions such as the existence of nations or religions as facts have felt true to most of us. They feel true, even though we might intellectually say there's nothing to it. It's just a concept that someone made up, but they feel true. Krishnaji's pointed out some of the consequences these biases have in terms of conflict and wars. What I am not aware of Krishnaji pointing out is the other side of the coin, which is that the same sort of beliefs biologists believe have engendered enormous amounts of cooperation between people. Initially, cooperation was restricted to people I knew or people who came with a reference letter from someone I knew. I wouldn't tend to trust and cooperate with people I didn't know. But then suddenly when these belief systems of entities like nations or religions came about, and then, everybody in this half of the room belongs to religion A or nation A as opposed to those folks, one of the big consequences of that has been a lot of cooperation between people who don't directly know one another. And this has led to all sorts of things that has created the modern human, not just contributed to the life of the modern human. These things change brains and change abilities. It's another long discussion. So there's an adaptive benefit to having type 1 errors rather than seeing the fact of the matter. So I'm sharing a little bit with you to say that the story doesn't end here. We don't have answers to what Krishnaji is saying, at least I don't. It was useful for me to say he couldn't have meant A and B and C as I shared with you. And there's a lot more to explain by way of trying to understand the process of awareness, observation, perception. And that's something for for another day. Yeah, so I'm happy to take questions. No need of that. No, if somebody has something to say, or we'll start with him. Yes.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying psychology is this a realm, it's a subset of biology, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So we're saying, so how does consciousness play into that? Or
I think I don't know. I don't know how to respond to your question till we at least at a minimum make sure we're using the word consciousness the same way, because it's used so many different ways by different people, and I might at least in normal usage, in English usage,
And also in biology, the word is not typically used the way Krishnaji used it, although he himself used it a variety of different ways. But the way it's usually used is being conscious of or being aware of. So then, the idea is that when I'm asleep, I'm not conscious, or when I'm in a coma or something like that. So, and then also being conscious or being aware of is allows for many things that are going on that you don't deny, but you say, I'm just not conscious of that. I'm not conscious of the enzymes being released by my liver right now and what that's doing. So you have to, we have to qualify that.
fair enough. I guess where I go with that is like the conscious versus the unconscious and the collective versus the individual. Are we saying like if we're if like archetypes exist and different collective ideas exist, are we saying those are matter? Is that what you're saying?
no, again I would.
I'm really not trying to be difficult, or I'm not trying to not answer, but I mean, there's a collective, let's say, body of information that no individual has, but most individuals have access to it, as literally as just typing a word into Google or something, and getting access to a bunch of things that I didn't have before I put forth my query. So if all the information that is contained in a database is a collective body of information, Um, I, I don't think that's how you're asking it, but so I'm saying that that's part of the answer, that there can be a collective body of at least information, right, that no one individual has, and that certainly would be a material or a physical process. That's easy to see. I don't think that's what you're asking. You're asking something more than that or different from that. And yeah, I don't know how to answer that. Again, it's not so much a cop-out, but if you ask a question like that, we are forced to either speculate or sort of say we don't know. But if you ask a question about a phenomenon, then we can say, well, what do we know about how biological or material processes address this? Do we need to invoke something beyond this? I personally like that approach, because then if something can be explained with a fewer number of variables, and if they can be explained with material processes, and if there is no need for a particular phenomenon for us to invoke something that is not material, then my preference is to leave that out.
Okay, so just maybe it's more fair to say we know that the emotion or the thought or even a dream itself is matter, right? That's
Yes.
part of biology. We don't know what's coming behind that or driving it or basically,
Yeah.
we don't know that.
We know a lot, but maybe not as
Much as we know the constituents itself of the process of dreaming or the process of feeling sad or angry or happy. Yes. We do know a lot that's behind it too, and what motivates it, but not as much maybe. Yeah. And I don't know if it comes collectively or not. There are certain things that you don't have to again invoke. I'll give you one example. There are lots of things that we're not conscious of, but that are real. For example, this has actually been done. In English, one has the phrase, the smell of fear. And it's not just a metaphor, it's literal. And here's one demonstration. So they took a bunch of rats. These are easy animals to do these kind of experiments with. They randomized them to two conditions, and with one condition, they exposed them to, for example, a cat or a cat odor. And what this reliably does in the vast majority of rats is it produces a fear response. And you can measure that response from their behavior, and if you were to take samples of blood or sweat or urine, you can also measure all kinds of stress hormone changes. Okay? So they do this with a group of animals and expose them to a fear stimulus, and they evoke fear. Now what they did was they literally took the air that was in that cage. That's all they did. They took a sample of that air and they took it to the cage of another group of rats in another room, and the two rooms weren't connected. They didn't share the same ventilation system, nothing. And when they simply let the air that they'd collected from the cage of rats that had been exposed to fear in this other cage, they could evoke the same fear response in this group. So literally there was something in the air, so there must be something that they were exhaling, and in fact there is, and they made progress identifying. So when the fear response happens, of course we're breathing in and out, and so obviously the physiological state, some of that presumably gets transferred into the air we're exhaling, which contains something that can be picked up by another animal, right, without exposure to the original stimulus, that then invokes the same response. So now, if one hadn't known that there's something in the air and so on, this could have looked awfully like, that big collective consciousness, something that is affecting another set of animals. How could this be a material process? But we know, at least with this example, that it is entirely a material process.
That's a very primal thing, though. You're talking
I agree. but I just gave that as an example, and many things build on. So anyway, I don't know. Yeah. If you don't mind, I'll take the next comment or question.
This talks about the sacred. Like he says, if your conditioning slows down,
Yes.
a matter of observation,
Yes.
something the state or sacred. Maybe that's what he's talking. Anyway, my
Yes,
question.
yes,
My question.
I guess
is,
he's talking about that.
My question is, how does the talk therapy work? A lot of people go to therapists and they talk and it brings them changes. How does it affect your brain? Like we are talking to you and having
I
conversation.
think, I don't know all the ways, I'm not a therapist.
But one suggestion is that, anything that helps create a little bit of a distance between that entity that's looking and that which he is looking at. If some distance is created, then there's a likelihood of seeing a phenomenon both more broadly and perhaps like a little more objectively than when one is immersed in the content of what one is looking at. So I would suggest that, some sort of talk, I don't know if that's the only way, but that might be one way. There's something very interesting I came across a few months ago. You all know this thing called virtual reality. You wear a headset and now it's so good that most people who wear those things, and let's say they're watching a baseball game, most people in 10 or 15 minutes, apparently, I've not done this, so I don't know in terms of first-hand experience, but I've read that it's so good, this technology, that in a short amount of time, people forget that they're actually wearing this thing. And it feels every bit as real as, when they're actually at a stadium watching a baseball game or something. So this article described how they were using a headset with patients who had, these were veterans who had PTSD. And they were saying to them, we're going to have you talk with Freud. Everyone knows he's dead. There's no such person. But they saw someone that looks like him in the thing, ask them one or two questions. Who are you? Tell me a little about your problems. Then they were told, now you start saying whatever you think Freud's going to say to you. And so they were the ones both asking the question and answering. But when they asked the question, the voice they heard was Freud's voice, like this German thing. They used like voice synthesizers. So even though and the important thing is, when they asked the question, they saw how they look from the vantage point of a person sitting across from them. So kind of like looking in a mirror, but not quite, because you also see these different, like, 3/4 angle. One of the reasons why we don't like looking at ourselves in photographs and in film, and most of us hate hearing our voice, is that's not how our experience of ourselves is, even in something as simple as how we look. Because we don't look at ourselves a lot of the time, we look at others. And the only time we typically look at ourselves is head on in a mirror. So it feels weird when I look at myself from the side or, in pictures and so on. And the act of making one even look at oneself literally, not inwardly, not with a lot of insight, but literally look at one from other angles, hear one talk with a different voice and answer, apparently helps open things up. And so it's an extension of your question of talk, where anyway, I didn't mean to go there, but I thought that was pretty cool if it, does help open things. By no means am I suggesting that this is total insight or that such a state exists and so on, but just in a relative sense. Anybody else? Yes. Sure.
You said something that I didn't quite, I'm not sure I heard it correctly, about life when you're talking about it being
Catalytic reaction.
And that it's copying itself, but then you said that errors are introduced.
Yes, correct.
And that the errors
It's an obligatory part of life.
So that is what you said.
Yes.
That's really, I thought, interesting.
Yeah, so
If something that's alive makes a copy that's identical, then there'll never be any variation that's produced. So if that form of life can exist in the circumstances it's in, all's fine and well. But if circumstances change, and one thing we know about circumstances or environments is that they do change, then something that works really well in one set of circumstances is unlikely to work as well in a different one.
Because
So-
the organism would not be adaptive.
Yeah, because it's copying itself. So, and so if it's reached some optimal state, and if every daughter is a carbon copy, then it's logical that if this form is well adapted to the current circumstances, how on earth are you going to get it to change if each subsequent one? So it's only if the copying process is reasonably accurate but not completely accurate. And this in evolutionary terms is the introduction of variation, which is random. The two parts to evolution. So a thing that replicates has to be very similar to but never identical to the parent. This is how variation gets produced, and then conditions select which variant works well. And that second part of it is called natural selection. So the two aspects to it, and this is how without any a priori design, without a designer, without a creator, you just, this process just gets going and then it takes care of itself. And so it will always produce variation, and it will produce some form of variation, or it will go extinct, or it will produce some form of variation that works well in different circumstances. Yes, so that's part of, yeah. Yes.
In regard to that question, from your perspective then, if something would replicate exactly in an identical form,
Yes.
and the environment or the conditions wouldn't change,
It would be fine.
then
It would be fine.
would that be the end of life?
No, it would go on. As long as conditions don't change, and if you've got something
That works well, doesn't matter, but if conditions don't change, if they remain static, now of course that's never the case, but if they do,
Because you are saying that those two conditions would make somehow life progress or change and grow different.
No, it changes right now
because two kinds of replications were tested and only one persisted and the other didn't. One form of replication that was tested was the faithful, accurate replication. The other was more or less accurate but with some variation, so a little bit inaccurate, okay? And then because it was found that conditions or environments always change, there's never been, as far as we know, any significant period of time on this planet where conditions have stayed the same. They've always changed.
I understood that. That's why my question is more as an abstract is,
Correct.
what would that mean that if nothing changes externally and everything is exact and the same cell continues reproducing in the same exact form,
it would be fine.
it could be fine, it would just stay
It
there.
would just stay there, and it would continue to
Perpetuate. It wouldn't be the end. Correct. There wouldn't be evolution, but there wouldn't be extinction either. Yes. 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 Yes.
Someone colloquially says, I want to heal myself. I want to heal past trauma, or I want to heal the trauma of my ancestors. This is a colloquial thing that I think a lot of people have said or heard.
correct.
From a neurobiological standpoint, what can be done?
Lots of things. So again,
It would depend on not so much what kind of trauma we're talking about, but how the perpetuation of the effects of that trauma is happening. So for example, This is just an example. So, in fact, we happen to be studying women who, when they were girls, were exposed to either physical or sexual abuse. Not exposed during pregnancy, and they're carrying a child now, but when they were girls, before the age of 5 or 6. And we have found that in certain women or certain girls, these kind of exposures to these kind of traumas produce what are called epigenetic alterations to the genomes in certain cells in the brain and body that then change their psyche and biology in a more or less permanent way. So then when they become pregnant, their biology during pregnancy is different from that of a woman who did not have this unfortunate exposure in her own childhood. And then this different biology has implications for impacting the development of the yet to be born child. So now if, let's say, so here's an example of an intergenerational perpetuation. So, coming from ancestors, not this child that's developing hasn't been exposed to any form of abuse, but is going to have to have the imprint of that which her or his ancestors were exposed to, in this case, one generation back. So by understanding the pathway or mechanism by which this gets transmitted, because these are all biological pathways. One thing to remember in the context of at least intrauterine life is there is no direct communication between the mother and the baby, because blood doesn't pass through. There's a lot of filtration at the placenta of constituents of fetal blood and maternal, but there's no direct passage of maternal and fetal blood. And of course, there are no direct nerves or neural connections either, the different nervous systems. So if we understand how these messages get across, who the carriers are and what these messages are, then it's possible to design strategies to block those. It might be pharmacological, it might be behavioral, it might be a combination of those. So the specifics would depend on the specifics of what we're talking about, but there certainly is the opportunity for breaking those kind of cycles of intergenerational perpetuation. And the breaking of those cycles, A, is possible, and B, can not only affect the body, but then probably could also affect the mental state of the offspring. So I'm not, that might not be a complete answer, but at least it's one line of thinking. Yes?
So just to reiterate something, biological conditioning has some distinct positives, nutrient
That's what I'm
sensing,
suggesting.
right? You're suggesting that. And also mutations have a positive because they allow adaptation.
Yes.
Okay, so how would you contrast this psychological conditioning as being so fraught? with
I
suffering
don't see it as fraud. So I think it's the same as
The biological. So for example, in one of the examples I shared with you, supposing there are two neighborhoods. I'm trying to make a simple example. Let's imagine one neighborhood is safe. Safe as in, there aren't predators, there's no violence, nothing of that sort. It's quite safe. And another neighborhood is dangerous in that high rate of crime or this or that, or if you're an animal, just predators that are waiting to eat you. So now psychologically, for somebody to exist in the neighborhood that is unpredictable, dangerous, violent, a psychological makeup that is high in anxiety, in arousability, in the stress response is adaptive, because an individual with those properties has greater success in navigating that neighborhood than someone who is calm, who is not of a suspicious temperament, who doesn't jump the gun when it comes to a stress response, who's not. You understand what I'm saying? So there can be a bunch of psychological characteristics that in a particular context could be quite adaptive and would be better to have if you were going to design somebody than other characteristics that we generally value. However, the problem comes when there is a mismatch between the characteristics and the conditions in which you find yourself. Is one way a problem happens. A second way a problem happens is that those same characteristics that might be adaptive in the short term, in the long term take a toll. So for example, if I have a system, a biological system that produces a massive stress response every time some minor thing goes off, it might serve me extremely well in the short term, but because that now is my predisposition or my attribute, my property, then after the age of 20 or 30 or 40, I'm going to wear down much quicker, because because that kind of response produces it's a wear and tear thing. So I might be fine when I'm young, but as I enter my 30s and 40s, I'm going to exhibit signs of accelerated aging. And so there's a cost to be paid for that. So these are one or the other of two ways in which, either in other contexts or over time, these psychological traits could have a cost, but they're adaptive in a certain situation. They're absolutely as adaptive as physical traits are.
So how do you reconcile adaptivity with this idea of conditioning as illusion?
Conditioning is what?
As psychological conditioning as potential for arising of
That's why I don't think
That's what. So I don't believe personally that psychological conditioning per se is bad. I think it's good, and that's why I suggested, or at least at the conference we thought, that maybe Krishnamurti is not talking about like not having psychological conditioning, but he's saying something we speculate that's different from that, which is somehow being free or being immune from the consequences of psychological conditioning rather than the phenomenon per se. But it's just speculation on our part. Yes.
Just picking up on what you said, it seems to me that you came up with your group a pretty clever way to harmonize what Krishnamurti said with your basic proposition, which is that conditioning is inevitable and it's good. And it strikes me, just stepping back, that that's a real imaginative jump and a very, very clever intellectually. But I wonder if, in my own reading of Krishnamurti, I can't think of a way to approach that textually to back up that view. And since there were apparently some real Krishnamurti scholars there who were biologists, were they able to come up with anything?
Yeah, so I'll ask Ravindra to address that.
So you heard his question, that intellectually this might be a clever way of reconciling what Krishnamurti said about conditioning and psychological conditioning with our notion that, well, he's not really saying end psychological conditioning. He's saying, there might be a way to end the consequences of psychological conditioning. And he's saying, because there were Krishnamurti scholars at our meeting, like you and others, how was that heard by some of the others in terms of like the feel of it, not so much the intellectual exercise?
I don't know how the others are.
Yeah, you want to come here?
No, I can speak.
My understanding of what Krishna is saying, he's speaking about an awareness of conditioning. So when I hear all this, I don't feel this, in fact I'm a little bit relieved that I don't have to go to all this trouble of trying to end anything. So whether or not awareness of conditioning can have any effect is another question. So the idea of the proposition that we're talking about freedom from the effects of conditioning, to me that also, I can see how you can say that's a jump. But I don't feel that that's what Krishna is saying.
Well, would you agree with me that if I had to characterize this, I would say that this is a radical, meaning literally going to the roots, a radical reinterpretation of Krishnamurti's message. Would you agree with that?
You mean what was proposed here?
Yeah. I mean, because I think that the typical understanding of Krishnamurti's teachings that I'm accustomed to is that one of his premises was that one can cut out conditioning at the roots. And I think what the professor is saying is that's impossible. I mean, going down to the substrate and so forth, as he said, that you cannot biologically pull out conditioning. So let's, if you accept that premise, then I think the only thing that you're left with, if you're going to say that Krishnamurti has continuing meaning, is a radical reinterpretation.
Well, I don't think you need that. I think if you accept that he says, he emphasizes the importance of an awareness that it's not trying to do anything. It's choiceless. It's not, that's what he's suggesting is possible. Is it true that it's possible? Because the suggestion is that we're trying to root out conditioning. But I'm not aware of him saying that. I'm aware of him saying to be aware without trying to do anything. So it's also a jump to say that the intention is to root out conditioning. So his emphasis is on attention, not intention.
Or put differently, you could say, I think what I'm hearing you say is that in your reading of Krishnamurti, he's talking about a solution and an end result. He's not interested in drilling down to find the cause. Is that a fair characterization?
I would even hesitate to say anything about an end result. I don't think he suggests any such thing. So the kind of mind that he's suggesting we are capable of is a very different mind. But it's not a mind that is actively removing something. It's simply not interfering with conditioning.
Thank you. That's helpful.
That was how we understood it.
Okay.
And something that I remember years ago, he was talking about how if your impact, if the weather exists, or you may be sick, or you may be tired, or you may be hungry, but it's how you're affected or not affected by those things that is consequential. And in a way, I can almost see an analogy here to what you're talking about, which is that conditioning exists, but it's whether that has a consequence for you.
There's actually a pretty good example that ties with the two of you gentlemen were just talking about. If you consider military training, SEALs are trained to operate right next to a ship when it's very dark. And when you're near the hull, it's really dark. You can't see anything. They get dropped off 2 miles offshore and then they swim towards that, right? So you can see some light coming through, moonlight or whatever, but once you get close to the ship, there's no light whatsoever. Anytime a SEAL trains to this, the first time they do it, they all panic. It's immense panic. Nothing changes after years of practicing. In other words, it's still as dark, they're still afraid, and all of these things, except their brains change dramatically through the training. They don't even notice that it's getting darker. So I think what you were talking about was this idea that you don't change anything, you don't do anything, you just recognize that, oh, I'm afraid, and you just.
I think it's 5, so maybe we'll end it here.
But I'm happy to talk with any of you if you want, but let's just end so that folks can get on with the rest of the evening. Thank you again, all of you.